Welcome. Hey, boys and girls, we're back again. Let me play my hat a little bit. How's that look? Yeah, with no warning again. We're back this Sunday. This looks like we're going to rock on the time. I don't know what that is. Peace, God. Yeah, so we're coming back in, and we're going to have a special guest today. David Smith of the Pearl Coalition, and we're going to continue this conversation. This is going to be the educational part of our transmission. We're going to talk about the Pearl Coalition. So who's seen 12 Years a Slave, class? Well, if you have, definitely, this is going to be part of this conversation that we don't get to hear about. So we're going to talk with David Smith, and he is the director of the Pearl Coalition. So we're trying to lock him in now. We're seeing when he comes in. But I'm kind of enjoying this. I think this is him right here. Okay, I think this one is him. Excuse me, everybody. But, I'm enjoying broadcasting with Facebook right now, so we're going to give it, but remember the rebroadcasts are on YouTube, I Call BS Radio. David is here, I think. So let's bring him in. Okay, so we're adding David. But, peace.
Ja, peace.
David Smith is here. Welcome. This is David Smith, the executive director of the Pearl Coalition. Right? You didn't fire yourself, right?
Not yet. I'm looking to fire. So you're not a success until you replace yourself. That's called successorship.
That's right.
So,
That's right. But yeah, So the big conversation we were having over the broadcast. I don't know if you got a chance to check out the YouTube page. I Call BS Radio on YouTube. That was my plug. But yeah, we've been having this ongoing conversation because it's my opinion that not enough people have enough information about history in general to really make solid opinions about what they think affects their life, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
I would wholeheartedly agree with that. I mean, I think the biggest takeaway from me in my quest to learn more about the Pearl Escape was that everything I thought I knew about DC as a fifth generation, I'm a fourth generation Washingtonian, but my children would be fifth, and I knew very little. And in DC public schools, when I was a kid, did a really great job of educating us on DC history. But there were a lot of little subtle symbols, and it was so much that was just hidden that it was actually a painful process for me to relearn American history, relearn African American history, and then relearn DC history, because it kind of shook me to my own core of what I thought was true. Yeah. And the truth sometimes does not feel good.
Yeah, you said that. I think I agree. A lot of people don't want to deal with it because it hurts. It's like everything it's like learning that the Easter Bunny's not real. The Santa Claus is really grandma or something like that.
Right. A perfect example.
But so you started off as you kind of had a similar background as my family. You were kind of like from like the elite of Washington, right? And what I know of you, you grew up in Northeast Washington, right? You grew up in Deanwood, right?
I did. So yeah, my family, my parents moved to Deanwood when I was 3. They moved from Ridge Road, 37th area in Northeast, off about Fort DuPont Park. My family kind of at that time lived all throughout DC, but largely in Ward 7. And yeah, my family had we were mostly entrepreneurs in my grandparents' generation and the generations that followed my grandparents, and that gave us a certain degree of independence. It gave us a certain degree of connectivity, and we were definitely very socially active. My great grandmother helped raise money to build St. Luke's Church in Marshall Heights, for instance. My grandfather was the late great Lloyd D. Smith, who after coming from war, fighting in the Korean War, he came back and worked for the Department of Planning for Ward 7 and 8.
Okay.
So it was from that context of my great grandmother and my grandfather on my father's side, and my great grandmother who was a Native American, and my grandmother who was her daughter who lived in Southeast on my mother's side. So it's some huge strong connections to DC just based on those two sides of my families of Washingtonians,
right,
kind of coming in a marriage, which were my parents. But when you say kind of coming from that elite class, I would equate that to I wouldn't even call it an elite class. I would call it more of a privileged class of folk who have access to resources, access to information, access to capital, which we had varying degrees of as African Americans when it came to access to capital.
This is true.
But real power isn't money. Real power is the combination of all of those factors. And so my family, to varying extents, had connectivity, and I benefited from that. And of course, I was unaware of it. And just to be clear, I did not benefit from the economics. No.
Yeah.
My mother and father were Deanwood heroes. My mother and my father served as president of our community organization over in Deanwood for 7 years. And during that time, they didn't make hardly any money, because when you're doing free work, it's free.
Basically.
Yeah, my father was the only male figure in the neighborhood. So he taught it, he coached, he Bible study, he was our basketball coach. I mean, my father saved like 30 or 40 men in his neighborhood. So it's nothing that I am that can tell my father. Every dude in this neighborhood knows that's in my age group. He saved us. But that created complexities for me. I mean, some people loved the fact that my father was the only man in the neighborhood, which I was unaware of.
Right.
So I learned how to fight, because I wasn't. And that was the beauty of DC. I mean, we still were family oriented. I learned how to fight because we could fight. But things have changed. But yeah, I come from that background. And as a result of that, I got a chance in my youth to just see a lot.
Okay. Okay. Now, I know where'd you go to school? North Carolina, right?
I'm an Aggie man. Aggie pride.
Okay, okay. Because I know you're like deeply rooted in the whole DC culture, and I know there's like a connection between Washington D.C. and North Carolina. And you talked about your great grandmother being the first one in the family on that side to be in Washington. So where did she come from?
That's the funny part about that side of the family. I haven't had opportunity to fully, vet it all. Her family, on my great grandmother's side, her family was steeped in, it's really kind of mixed because they were Native, they were African, there was some European descendancy there. So it's very difficult to really trace her full family, and I just haven't invested the time, quite frankly. But I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of part of the whole story, is that we have this history that is so complex that it's very easy to just look at like, oh well, what happened? Oh, watch this movie Roots, and whatever happened to you was similar to that. So just walk with that. You'll be okay.
Right. Look. What I've learned is Roots is not the predominant story of our people. Roots is the most of all the things that I saw in my youth. Roots by far, symbolically, was one of the best things I ever saw at that time, because it woke me up to some of the subtle realities of slavery,
right,
and how it impacted our people as a culture. But that's just one aspect of a Southern plantation in one family,
right?
But you're talking about ethnic groups from hundreds of different tribes and hundreds of different people, mixing, marrying, intermarrying. Some people were indentured, some people were enslaved, and all of those things are true in my family. So I'm very careful to, unequivocally say this is what it is. But just to kind of answer your question, my great grandmother Frances came from they came down from Chicago, but her family was in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Virginia. Some of them were very light, almost light bright to white, and some were so dark and black that you couldn't see them. The only thing that I found consistent over the generations is that all of them had connections to Native American indigenous tribes, indigenous people and culture.
Right.
And they all shared this deep-seated faith in the Creator.
Right.
Some were Catholic, some were Christian, some were Muslim, or some, different faiths. But how that plays out is how they treat people and how they love people. And when I look at my family's legacy, that's what I see. I see a true faith in God, and I see a deep-seated belief in love and the golden rule. So that's true on both sides of my family.
Well, times was hard back then. So, I mean, it was very important to believe in God. you know what I mean? Like, there was no TV. You had to believe in God.
Right. Yeah, that was the truth. There was no TV. Entertainment was human beings, So.
But so in the midst of this, you said a couple of important things, because you talked about like the intermixing of people. I think that narrative that people have, where it's like we're gonna forget about all these other people that were around, and it's a lot easier for the conversation to say, oh well, the slaves all came from Africa, and the Indians, they all died, and these people were here and these people were here, and it's these broad strokes over history that let stories that may not fit into the broad stroke narrative, like the Pearl, kind of get swept under the rug. So, I was talking to you earlier, and going back to your grandfather, Lloyd D. Smith. We're gonna hop around your family a little bit from generation to generation, but you were telling a story about how he actually came across the Pearl and how that became something that you as a grandson decided to keep on with that legacy. So can you talk a little bit about how that all came about?
Yeah, absolutely. This is probably one of the most important questions when it comes to the Pearl story for me to answer. My grandfather, again, worked for the district government after he came back from the Korean War. He lied to go to war. That was the kind of men they were back then. They were very, they believed in, patriotism or what have you.
He was young.
He was young.
Yeah.
And young men go fight old men's wars.
Right. Yeah. That's what my grandfather did too.
And he really believed that not only was it necessary for the health of the country, but it was necessary for the advancement of the family and our people. So he went to war. And on his return, he took a job with the Department of Planning here in Washington, D.C. And in his role as the Ward 8, Ward 7 planner, he learned a lot. He learned a lot about the history, and but more importantly, he learned about policies, and he learned about the law related to those policies and how they were being enacted generationally in a way that was good for some and bad for others. And in his research, one of his assignments at this time, I think the Southwest Waterfront was still considered Ward 8. One of his assignments was figure out what to do with that place. I mean, it was like, historically, the Southwest Waterfront was the hub of the Underground Railroad in Washington, D.C. Because it was a waterfront, the mariner community, the maritime culture is one of the most eclectic cultures and the most educated cultures in the world, unbeknownst to most of us. They speak the most languages, they travel the most and meet the most people. So their heart toward people and maritime law in itself is what our country's law is based on.
Right.
So because the Southwest Waterfront was a maritime center for Washington, D.C., where most of our goods, commercial goods, slaves, everything came through those ports, the Southwest Waterfront was key in the escape of the indentured, the bonded, the enslaved here in Washington, D.C. So when he took on the role as a city planner, my grandfather always had a passion for truth and history. So I'm not sure if his initial intent was to find the Pearl.
Right.
But I am sure, based on my conversation with him, that when he found it, he realized that it was the most important piece of history that Washington, D.C. had, and that the story needed to be told. So he took everything in his power in the position at this time as just a planner to bring that story to the forefront. But to his he wasn't too pleased with the city's excitement about the story as in his role as a district employee.
What do you mean by that? Like, were they not excited? Or?
If they weren't excited, I mean, one of the key statements, and I say this to anyone that's watching now, the Bible for those who are Christian, the Quran for those that are Muslim, and the Torah for those that are Jewish, and we can go to the Codex for those that are Indian or Hindu. All of them say the same thing. You invest your treasure, with your time and your treasure is invested to what you really believe in. So when it comes to the city's interest in our African American history and culture, how much time and money and energy has the city really put into it? And it depends on leadership. I mean, that varies. But my grandfather wasn't satisfied at the time with the level of investment in preserving and telling the story of the Pearl. So he just started doing it on his own outside of his job. He still continued to do his work he was on the zoning board. He was on all these different boards throughout the city. He left the city government and started Marshall Heights Community Development Organization. And let me be clear, from a family perspective, he started the organization and the mission, if you go read it now, so we could own our community. That means land first. I mean, the business is secondary. And after that process was complete, then we could focus on educating our own children, taking care of health. I mean, when you have land and you have businesses, you control everything else. And my grandfather understood. So he started Marshall Heights with that in mind. And from that platform, he was able to get back into the other work that he was passionate about, which included the Pearl.
Right.
So while building community, doing economic development projects, he started City First Bank with the goal of trying to preserve African American ownership of land. That's what the bank's purpose was, and to really help minority and African American communities, specifically in DC, own land, so we could stay here in DC as the prosperity arrived. The Pearl story was the only thing that really kept him going. He partnered with Josephine Pachuco, who was a university professor. And I don't even want to, I always say the wrong university. So
all right. We'll fill that in later.
Right, I'll fill that in later. Yeah. But Josephine Pachuco wrote the first book, working with my grandfather and working with Asbury Church and Mount Zion Church in Georgetown. Ebenezer Church in Maryland has a lot of descendants of the Pearl who are unaware that they're descendants. But that church and the people of that church, the elders of that church, lived in Georgetown during this time period. Most of them were so these churches, these historic, some of them are mega now,
right?
But the predominant Antioch Baptist Church here in Deanwood, the Edmondson family, I grew up with some of the descendants of the Jennings and Edmondson family in Antioch Baptist Church here in Deanwood, and didn't even know it.
Wow.
Didn't even know it. My study teacher was a Bell, and her family was on the Pearl Escape, and I didn't even know it. They didn't even know it.
Yeah, I knew some Bells in Connecticut. I don't know if they're connected.
They were Moors. I mean, their father was a Moor. But anyway, so he found his history. The city, he then started NCRC, National Capital Revitalization Corporation, which then merged into the Anacostia Waterfront Initiative, et cetera, et cetera. But in that role, he used the Pearl as the quintessential center point of why the Southwest Waterfront should be developed.
So that was
that was the catalyst.
Interesting now, because now it's just for the baseball part, right? So that's the part you're talking about.
No, I'm actually talking about where the wharf is.
Oh.
Where the baseball stadium is and where the soccer stadium is closer to Buzzards Point, which is where my office is now.
Right.
At the Matt Henson Center.
Okay.
That's also a location of the Pearl Escape.
Okay.
So the location, Buzzards Point, is where they loaded and unloaded, and the Southwest Waterfront at 7th Street is where they loaded and unloaded.
Because when you think about the layout, now we're gonna get specific or Pacific, right?
Yeah.
But when you think about the layout, I mean, I don't know, I can't imagine what it looked like then, but I remember, like, a few years ago, last time I was there, you know, it's really secluded. And even back then, like that's why I thought like automatically, like it's very wooded, but it's big enough where you can kind of get a small ship in there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so
Mm-hmm.
so that's why, you know, I thought there, but you're talking about a little bit further down, kind of like where the new development is, kind of where the highway kind of reaches over. I think
Right.
395 comes across there. You see that area right there.
Right. The Southwest Waterfront development that has just been completed was
Mm.
started by Lloyd Smith.
Oh, really? So that all that.
Yes.
Oh, wow, that's what's up, man.
Yes. And for me, that's like a happy and a sad thing.
Mm.
And it's a happy thing because it's great to walk and see that my grandfather's vision has become to fruition. It's sad because the people that he started for don't live there now.
Yeah, shit. Nobody can afford to live there.
And I don't get it.
I don't think Americans can afford to live there.
Right. I think so. Yeah. Right. And the Pearl is in dock there currently, also. And I think that was his goal. His goal was to use the Pearl as a multiplier economically to create jobs and income for businesses to stabilize their economic ability to stay.
Right.
So the goal was to build the boat, create the businesses, do the development at the same time.
Right.
That way people that lived there could actually own and you know, be able to afford to stay and make profit. A couple generations go by. This conversation is non sequitur. So that's the Southwest Waterfront. The reason why he did so much work there, again, is because that was his job at the time. You know, once it wasn't his job, now it was about how do we develop this thing and how can we highlight this story.
Right.
And you know, the story unites us.
Right.
You know, and that's why it was so critical for him to do. You know, a lot of the things that, and that's how I got involved.
Right.
I got involved because I was at the time the Anacostia Riverkeeper, and my grandfather, who didn't need me to do anything. I mean, the man was brilliant. He had way more money. He had way more connections.
Right.
I was funding money from him. He was helping me pay for college. Right. But I was really good at the time. I was really good at working with young people. That's how we met, John.
That's right. David actually gave me like my first grown up job. Actually.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah,
man.
David actually gave me like my first like not hood organized job where I could make a good amount of money. And he did that when I had a record.
Yeah,
and
I made sure you got $1 too.
Yeah, and he made sure I was not out there like Monique at all.
No.
You know what I'm saying? I was able to, you know, when he talked about, you know, for the audience, like just to solidify what he's talking about, like when he talked about his mom helped me get an apartment. You know what I'm saying? Like,
right.
Yeah, like his mom's helped me get like my first grown up apartment, my home bachelor pad, like, you know. So this was real because, you know, I came and I had a prison background. You know what I mean? Like, and I'm in a whole new city. I was like, I need to move away from here to be able to get opportunity. You know what I mean? And
a man is without except in his own town.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
So
I feel that way here in DC, you know.
yeah. I mean, I can understand it.
I love my city, though. Let me say, I love my city,
but
it's DC.
Right.
It is who it is.
Right. But you know, enough about us. You know,
enough about us.
Let's talk about this story, man. Because the Pearl is different. Because the Pearl is connected to a lot of things and people that people are familiar with. You know, that the average roots deep, I say like that, roots deep knowledge on slavery you're going to be familiar with because, you know, there's Frederick Douglass was moving around the area. You have that kind of connection. The John Brown Rebellion is connected there. You know, Harriet Tubman and of course the new and the mainstream, of course, the 12 Years a Slave story in the Solomon Northup. All of these people, maybe not contemporary, but they are connected to this story that most people have no idea even happened. You know, we didn't get those BET movies on the Pearl back in the day.
We did not. So just for the audience sake, if they're unfamiliar with the story, I'll give a quick synopsis. I really encourage everybody to go to the website at www.pearlcoalition.org.
That's right.
And then click on the escape. Now you'll see there's just a very short snippet of the escape, and I did that on purpose. And the reason why I did that on purpose,
okay, I'll show them what it looks like. We go right here. We help everybody out. It looks like
great.
There it is. The escape. This is the page. www.pearlcoalition. All right. So everybody make sure that they check out that webpage. It's very important to donate. The donate is right there at the front. So, make sure that when you look, if you have an opportunity to donate. But moving along.
All right. What's interesting about the page itself is as you go, you notice that there's just some overviews. And the reason why that is because I work with young people, as you know, John. I think the most critical thing is for us as adults is once you're taught something as a child, for instance, most people think that the Star-Spangled Banner is the American national anthem, and it is not. It is the Star-Spangled Banner, which is why it's called the Star-Spangled Banner. But we were brought up in school where we educated on the differences. And so once something becomes symbolically a part of how you see yourself, it is very hard to de-educate. So what we've done on the website is we've tried to make it not opinion oriented, and we try to not put our own opinions into his story, and just provide you resources. So this is just a starting point. We have some other, pamphlets and booklets that our contractors and our young people throughout the city and the region, DC, Maryland, and Virginia, have generated. I would encourage you to click the links, and those will take you to the authors and people who really have spent their whole life only studying little small aspects of this story. So as you go through the website, I'm going to give you a very macro view of it, and then we can kind of drill down to the specifics. But I'll give you the short version. In 1848, 77 people escaped on a boat or schooner called the Pearl. They escaped from Buzzards Point, which is at the Matthew Henson Center now, and they're actually, Buzzards Point was the National Park Services. I believe they just sold it to a developer, sadly. And then there is a Southwest Waterfront at the 7th Street. They escaped from there. The Southwest Waterfront area were mariners, like I said, they were abolitionists. They tend to be very mixed race. They definitely tend to not be racist because of their culture and their education. But they detested, most mariners are what we consider now pirates. They detested slavery. Most of the people that we even call pirates today, like Blackbeard and these other, they used to raid slave ships. They were actually good guys, but we were taught that they were pirates. So from that context, that was what going on during that era. You still had these people who were, bad players in the American theme or the American system of capitalism. So the escape happened specifically because of three families. It started with the Edmondsons. The Edmondsons had daughters who were being sold into slavery in Tennessee. Tennessee was expanding their slave territory, and they were specifically looking for girls to breed. All right. And they were looking for brawny, intelligent, highly skilled workers. So they came to DC for that. We weren't that roots, yes, a boss image that Hollywood portrays. No, we were the Frederick Douglass, the Benjamin Bannekers. Right. We were articulate, and we still are, by the way. And we were articulately intelligent, very skilled, based on generations of passed down knowledge. It wasn't no university structures. We were building this city based on what we learned specifically from our fathers' fathers' fathers. So that's what it was.
So it was skilled laborers.
Very skilled, from everything from engineering to law to government to construction to building ships. It wasn't an area in this city, in any profession, that we weren't skilled in, even medical. And without the degrees, because what was necessary was skill at that point. Right. So you had these families that were in these positions who had bartered for passage. So if I lived in Europe or in Africa or the Middle East, wherever I came from, I needed to get to America. I would exchange my freedom, or I would exchange my skill for passage on a boat. We romanticize that today as indentured servitude, for instance. Right. That's kind of how we romanticize that term. And then there are other cases where people came from Africa through the transatlantic slave trade, where, you know, they were brought here by force, kidnapped, horrible conditions, raped. All right, all of that was going on. You had these bondsmen from Europe who were being just treated like crap, who their contracts weren't being honored. And you had these Moors who were very educated, who had also exchanged passage that were here.
But they were, you know, basically, when you look at it, and I don't mean to cut you, but basically when you look at it, in a way, to the empire that was in place and that was expanding into the quote unquote new world, when you're talking about that period of time, you essentially had undesirables. So the bondsmen that we talk about, right? When we talk about the indentured servants, like when, you know, because there's like a romanticizing of the Irish and the white indentured servants, but let's be clear, those people were, you know, by and large criminal. You know, those are people who were, you know, they may have been, you know, locked up in debtor's prison in Europe, and it's the same as the population in Australia and things like that. You know, people were by and large criminals who were sent there. The French sent their criminals to New Orleans, and gave them prostitutes to marry. You have these kind of stories being told, and we romanticize them and make them think like, you know, they were the same. But even when we go back to the Africans were already prisoners of war by other African tribes. And they were sold into slavery. And there may be certain instances where people were captured per se, but, you know, by and large, it was, you know, that was feeding into the pre-existing war. The slave trade basically capitalized off of pre-existing problems in Africa, or pre-existing. I can't even call conflict a problem. I think it's just something that happens when you have groups of people.
Yeah, and you know, it's really, and I think this conversation is the kind of conversation that my grandfather was hoping for when he started the Pearl. The boat isn't about just the escape. I like to look at it as a spider web, because as you look into the Pearl and you see all these connections, you realize that this is a very complex conversation. And many of the things that were happening in 1848 that caused the escape, the things that led up to the escape, are the exact same things that I'm seeing in today's society right here in DC.
Yeah.
And, you know, too often we want to say it's white people. We want to say, you know, it's the rich people. But that's not what I see right now. What I see right now is a bunch of middle-class black folk in positions of power who care more about their silk sheets and their BMWs and Mercedes than they do about thousands of children in my neighborhood.
Yeah.
That's what I see. I see house niggas, and I'm going because I'm talking to you, John.
Yeah. So this is I call BS. We can say whatever we want here. We could be very clear.
And folk who know me know, and I'm hoping that people can hear my heart and not necessarily be offended by my words. But sometimes, you know, we've tried diplomacy, and we've tried to talk truth without saying what the truth is. And that is how you create falsehoods. When something is wrong, it's wrong. You can try to say it any way you want. But a child only understands it, is that right or wrong?
Right. So
we have to talk history the same way. And during this period, let's go back to the Pearl Escape, those dynamics were working. So it was 77 people that got to that boat on that night, on April 15th.
Okay.
Because Sam Edmondson, the older brother of the Edmondson girls, was trying to protect his sisters.
That's right.
And he worked with the church. Now, here's something that should shock most people. There were almost as many white folk or others other than African descendants on that boat. They were native descendants that were mixed. They were mulattoes. They were Irish. They were Jews. They were Muslims. They were Christians. Everyone came together. Muslims, all these religions, all these churches, all these social economics and racial backgrounds came together to support this escape, because it was not about the race. It was about the treatment of the people.
Right.
And they were disgusted at the fact that they were going to be raping and abusing and using these men and women to create a new slave market in Tennessee. It was just too much for the churches and the people of faith to bear, and the people that had money to bear.
Right. Because I don't think that people really understand that. People kind of look at it like this, right? People look at it like uh, there was freedom, and everybody was in Africa, like holding hands, and Native Americans were here, and everything was cool, and then there was slavery, and it was horrible, and the white man is so horrible because and what people don't understand is that slavery grew on the people, meaning that it was life. There was a point when everyone was essentially a slave. And people don't get that. There was a point that the average person, unless you were very wealthy, you basically lived the life of a slave. You worked all day, to your fingers to the bone, for very little or nothing. That was essentially the life of everyone. So then when you had this institution of slavery, and it wasn't like someone's being chased around with a whip. It was basically like, you just do all your work for this person. I may do all my work for the state. You know what I'm saying? I may do all my work for this lord who owns the property I live on. But this person does all their work for this person, right? And then that transfers to America to a very similar model. Then we have this Bacon's Rebellion, when then it becomes, well, black people can't own white people anymore.
Right, right. And what's interesting about that comment is, if you look at the laws, the original laws for our country, they were all based around slavery. Mm-hmm. You had the first legal case was actually a black Moor suing a white neighbor because the white neighbor helped his black Moors escape his plantation. Yeah, and the black slave owner was wrong. He had given these guys a 7-year contract and agreements for exchange. They built his entire plantation in Virginia. They helped because they were the only ones that were educated on how to do everything. Right. Everyone else in those conditions that you just said. Some came from debtor's prison, and it was just way more than the Irish. I mean, you're talking about Europe. Right. But not all of them came over here with evil intent. They weren't racist. They were taught racism. And this is an example of that. I mean, the black Moors had helped him rebuild his entire farm, taught him how to plant stuff because Africans knew that. Native Americans knew what to plant. If you're coming from Europe, how would you know to plant in this climate? Mm-hmm. So when you think about that kind of the reality of the moment, the actual white, the neighbor was grateful and provided the black Moors or indigenous with a buggy and a horse, a mule, right, so they could leave. And so when the guy came back and realized that this guy had helped his slaves escape, he sued the white guy and won. And then Virginia passed a law that manumission, meaning that black people could never be free, and black women could never be free, and there could be no. It's a whole bunch of laws that came as a result of this. We couldn't be intermarried, but this is the real. Here's the real, and this is how I see today's society. There are two things to remember when we talk about modern and slavery during this period. America was founded on this premise. The only way you could vote or be a citizen in this country is two ways: no debt, okay, no debt. That's the key. And you had to own a business and land. Those are the rules. Right. So you need to own your land and a business, meaning you had to be a productive citizen of society with no debt. So that has never been taken off the books. That's still on the books. But that's when people, and when we talk about perception, right? People don't even know when they're undesirable. You don't know, right? Because what did Harriet Tubman say? I freed thousands of slaves, but I would have freed more, but they didn't know they were slaves. They didn't even know they were slaves. And when you talk about that, like if you're not doing that, if you don't have your own business, if you don't own land, and you're not, because you can have all those things and be in debt. You're in debt. You're a debtor. Mm-hmm. You have a bond. Someone has your signature, and you are subject to them. And until that debt is paid, there's legal recourse. Now, I will admit we've come a long way, and I can go to court. I owe debt, so I'm working my little debt down. Right. So we all are in that trick bag as Americans, but the awareness of it is key. The second point I wanted to bring up related to that period was manumission. And so there were like 3 or 4 ways you could be free as a black person. You could stop a slave rebellion, which was the number one concern of our government. You need to understand that.
Mm-hmm.
The government was functioning and our military was developed not to defend our borders. If you know our history, we got our asses kicked every single time, except like the Revolutionary War. You know, who started that? Crispus Attucks, a black man. Who were the heroes? Indentured bondsmen or slaves or free Africans and indigenous who came together with Europeans to fight against the British under the promise of no more slavery. The War 1812, where the Star-Spangled Banner was written. We got our asses kicked. The British under General Cockburn actually came into the Chesapeake Bay, killed a few slave owners, freed the slaves, gave the slaves in the Chesapeake Bay the option. You can go with us to the Caribbean, or you can help us destroy all these plantations in Virginia and Maryland and in D.C. All the slaves got on his boats, came up to D.C. and wiped our behinds out.
Wow.
All right? Yes, that's the truth about the War 1812. Those were slaves who had joined forces with General Cockburn and came to D.C., burned down the White House, the Capitol, burned down Bladensburg, burned down all our bridges. And that's where the story of Paul Jennings and the Pearl began. Because they actually knew who he was when they came to burn the White House down and allowed him to go back in and save the art. Why? And so those are questions that you got to ask. Why is Paul Jennings known for running into the war? That's how I learned him. He saved all the art. Why? Because it probably was his, you know?
Right. It's my money.
But that's the point. My point is, so manumission is an important understanding. You had to stop a slave rebellion. Then you could be free, but you couldn't leave the plantation. You had to have 13 children if you were a woman, or 12 children. You could be free, but you could not leave the plantation, but you could have a house by the master's house. You know what that really meant. You had to save the master's life. That usually is a result of a slave rebellion. So you get, or you had to invent something that would make the master so much money that your debt would be wiped out and you could be free. In all of these cases, you still had no rights as a citizen. You just no longer had to toil, and you still couldn't leave the plantation.
Right.
So that was manumission. You know, so between the reality of what our economic system says about freedom and what manumission said in 1612, 1618, 1624, you got to look at the context of what America and what was going on around the Pearl Escape. That's why all of these people were escaping. They were debtors. Their debt was being sold to Tennessee landowners, and they were going after their daughters, because if you were born into debt, your children also belonged to the person that held your bond. So these are legal matters. So Daniel Bell, who worked at the Navy Yard, had 7 children, and he could not get his children free. So they were on the boat. The Edmondsons, they could not get their children free. They had money, but they wouldn't let their children go because they were skilled. They were on the boat. Paul Jennings, Dolly Madison had Paul Jennings' daughters. She was Dolly Madison. She came to D.C. specifically to sell her slaves. They were on the boat. So you had all of these different families, White House, Capitol Hill, Southern Maryland, Alexandria, Virginia, all over D.C. on this boat trying to get their family out of here. It was a unified story. Of course, it had a horrible impact on the African that was on the boat after the escape, because they were captured. So we don't know what happened to about 30 people. I'm assuming because the records we have not been able to, that's why we need donations. We need to be able to bring in more researchers. But my assumption is because those people were not of the undesirable class. They probably were married, a white man married to a Native American woman. So they hid him. Or, the 2 captains on the Pearl were white. Now, they put them in jail for 4 years. They hated them. But all the other white folk on the boat, their information seems to be
disappeared.
Gone. Right. So then you have the rest of the slaves that were captured were being sold to New Orleans and Mississippi by the same slave company that had captured Solomon Northup and sent him to New Orleans. That was the punishment for the educated nigga, because you wasn't killing no educated nigga.
No.
You was going to, he was worth more money, but you had to get him out of here. So they sent you all the way to Louisiana to do that. So the Pearl Escape is this confluence of cultures, confluence of social economics, confluence of belief systems. It wasn't really about race, because it was about race, but it was, that's a construct that was created. It was really about power, money, you know, and the mistreatment of human beings.
Right.
And that grandfather knew if we could tell this story correctly, and then we could unify people across racial, socioeconomic lines and religious lines, and bring people together on the sovereign right of a human being to be free. And so that's what this is about. And that's why my grandfather was so passionate about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I got involved right before he passed, because he asked me to develop the youth component and the business component.
Okay.
Yeah.
Man, I mean, so it's so much now, like, because you just laid a lot on me that I didn't even know, just in terms of the connection and just in terms of my connection. Shit, I mean, I feel like I walked, you know, but you know, like, so we don't have this clear picture. You know, we don't really have. We have a good enough picture of it, but we don't, because we you know, stories like this need to get out and they need to be developed, because you know, it kind of dispels the average, you know, the average idea. And you said so much, you know, because when we talk about the ongoing conversation is Black development, right?
Right.
How do we develop people today who are, you know, it can be argued are not much in the standard of living today compared to then. Perhaps we may not be in a much better situation now. You know what I mean? And we're talking about now being what, 40 some odd years removed from the official end of Jim Crow. And in the midst of that, I mean, there's so many things you just said. We got to unpack it, David.
Yeah, I know, my bad.
No, you good.
You're right. It's just I wanted to go there really quick to give you an example. Right after the official end of Jim Crow and Thurgood Marshall's case, Brown v. Board of Education.
Right.
You know, Anacostia was all Black. By the way, the escape happened. A lot of people came out of Anacostia and got on that boat. Mm-hmm. A lot of them lived in that area in D.C. What most people don't know is that Anacostia was built for the Navy. The Navy Yards employees generally lived in the Anacostia region. That was heavily populated by the Irish and other cultures, mixed cultures.
Right.
After Brown v. Board of Education, there was a mass exodus of all of those same people and upper middle class Black folk to the suburbs, because they knew that there was going to be a retaliatory response on African American communities, and no one talks about that. But my point was, here's something that people need to be conscious of at the end of that 40 years. What were the policies that were developed? The policies in response to the end of Jim Crow and legal segregation was the creation of funding mechanisms to create parochial schools, and the funding mechanisms to do economic development outside the Beltway system. And then you had these housing tracts that were created in suburbs that, you know, of course you couldn't be minority or African or Jewish or anything to move into. You couldn't use your FHA loan. So the economics is the game. They changed from the in-your-face racism, in-your-face classism, in-your-face Jim Crow to a subtle form of economic slavery, where now you're just going to create policies where you economically don't have position to participate. So, and those same things are being pushed now. If you look at Chicago, I mean, you got all the poor people in Chicago move off waterfront property to one area of Chicago. And you're from Chicago, Johnson.
No, I'm from Bridgeport, but it happened there too. But I've lived there too. These are all places that I lived. You gotta watch this.
I make a Chicago dude.
Yeah. Nah. I'm a proto savage. I'm not a neo savage.
Yeah, but you see my point. And now you got all of these poor people moved into a community in concentrations without social, integration and jobs, no economics. Yeah. You're gonna have a cesspool of murder. And that's what you got. That happened in D.C. And it's about to happen again if we're not careful. So what is happening now that's close to what happened 40 years ago? They're not funding. Now you got charter schools in these same communities. You got massive gentrification. You have so a lot of that's why history is so critical because you can see policy that consistently repeats itself to accomplish the same outcome in a different way, and that speaks to your point about quality of life. One of my favorite people when it comes to this subject is Dr. Claude Anderson. He wrote Trichonomics, and one of his key points is, you know, at the end of the Civil War, African Americans own, I think, 1.5% of the GDP. We are now down to 0.5% GDP. So when you look at it from data, we have lost income after being freed. So you really got to ask yourself what's important. And I think that's what we're talking about. And I've come to realize, based on where we're living now, quality of life is important.
Right.
Quality of life.
That's what people are looking for. So when you're a slave, you're the only when you were living in anywhere in slave territory circa, you know, late 1800s to the mid 1800s, right? There was a wealthy person who owned slaves. Then there were several people who worked for that wealthy person who were also, you know, white, and they weren't the skilled labor. You know, they may be working over, they may be overseers, but a lot of them were kind of serfs, and they were kind of planters too, and they kind of rented space from this wealthy person, and they may do handyman work for him in most cases where the slave would be the skilled labor. You know what I mean? That white person may be hired to bring the iron, to carry the iron in for the black blacksmith, but for the blacksmith, you know, they didn't have. So when you were a slave and you looked at what freedom was, you may be looking at it like, well, freedom is the same situation as them. And then those people may be looking at things like, well, freedom is really this. No one is really essentially free unless you've broken the barrier of class. So when you look at, you know, the slaves or because it's hard to, you know, I don't like using ambiguous terms, David.
Yeah.
So when we use terms like African American and we use terms like Black, they're ambiguous terms because they don't really describe who and what the people who we're describing were. So we'll just say slaves.
Right.
And we'll use that ambiguous term, you know?
Yeah, it allows the person that's using the term and the person that's hearing the term to disassociate themselves from the people that we're actually talking about.
Right.
You know?
So
no,
oh, I'm sorry. So like you talked about, many of these people on this boat it wasn't just a boat full of quote unquote Black people. It wasn't a boat of Africans boarding this boat, you know, boarding to be free in the North, as the story goes. You had and it says it on the website, multi-ethnic. This whole thing involved like a multi-ethnic, you know, a group of people who wanted to be free and wanted to see others free. It wasn't just a black and white thing.
No, it wasn't. And the most interesting part is, as it relates to that multi-ethnic, you know, is the church, you know, and the role of the church. You know, it's not what I see now. The role of the church then, they were the rebel rousers. They were militant. The same people who funded the Pearl Escape funded the John Brown Rebellion. I mean, you had Frederick Douglass help people get to the boat that night. You had Harriet Tubman help weeks prior get people to this area so they could get to the boat. You know, she wasn't involved in the actual escape that night, but she helped people escape to this point along the river. Then you had John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams defended after he won the Amistad case.
That was in Connecticut. That was in New Haven.
That was in New Haven, which is why the Pearl was avoiding Connecticut. Okay, they was going to Canada. You know what I'm saying? They was going to go to Delaware and then get passage to Canada because that was the only way to be free at the time. Relative freedom, anyway.
Right.
But you had these. Look at all the different players that were involved, and the reason why they were involved is because, like you said, it wasn't about necessarily the race. I mean, that was for the ignorant. folk who you use that kind of stuff to divide people. I mean, we see that now,
Mm-hmm.
right? You know, them and us.
Right.
And like you talked about the dynamic on the plantation where maybe a white serf, someone who was a bondsman per se, may have had a job, and his job was go get the steel from the shipyard and bring it here, or from the factory and bring it here, so the blacksmith, the skilled labor, the indigenous or the African can actually do something with the steel.
Right.
Because they could travel without being accosted or killed. Being white gave you traveling rights. Being black gave you no traveling rights.
Right, because like you said, if you got free through manumission, you still had to stay on the plantation because your freedom only meant something in this space.
In this space. Because the national freedom, no matter whether you were in the North or the South, you were not going to be protected by the law.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's just the bottom line. The law saw us as property. Only people that had rights were landowners,
right.
and business owners,
right,
and white, and that was the law. So I mean, that's just an important thing to remember.
You know, they had one thing I like to add is that there are instances in history where if you were black and you were free, it was essential that you had to be able to protect your freedom, which meant that you had to know how to fight. They had to be afraid of you. You had to be willing to kill to protect your freedom on a day-to-day basis. If they weren't gonna mess with you, if they knew they had no wins with you, then they weren't gonna mess with you. And then that also ties into why you see a lot of us going to the West, where gun control wasn't as staunch. Because remember, gun control is a lot, when you talk about the manumissions, because, we unpacking, man, you said a lot. But, the manumissions were about...
that was a tricky...
Right.
I was speaking some tricky seeds. Go research this.
Right. You was dropping on it. Because gun control ties back into slave rebellion. Why do we have gun control? You know what I mean? Why do they want to take it away?
Just for folk that are listening, all our great military institutions were not built to protect America. Not one of them. The citadels in South Carolina. That was after the massive slave rebellion in South Carolina that led to the victory in South. Those same folk fought in the Civil War and took South Carolina. Had they not won in South Carolina, we'd be having a different conversation right now. Then you got Annapolis. Because of the escapes that kept happening, the rebellions in Maryland were ongoing. So when we fast forward to Abraham Lincoln, by the way, the people on the Pearl got free. They worked with Harriet Beecher Stowe. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Her brother in New York was at the church in Broadway. They fundraised to free the slaves. Then the ones that they got free came to New York working with Frederick Douglass, Sumner, Webster, and the Stowe family, and helped Abraham Lincoln win in Pennsylvania. And so that's how deep the Pearl history is. These same people, these same abolitionists, and that's the only way to really talk about them.
Right.
Not black folk, white folk, not Christian, not Muslim.
Right.
They were abolitionists. And they came together and they raised the money because they understood the only way to be able to win this real fight was to change the law and the economic policy that was keeping people enslaved and that was creating slavery as a result of the system in itself. So they got Abraham Lincoln on the ballot, and, the rest is history. I mean, but that's how powerful, the story is. But look at the people that were involved, y'all. I mean, you got Harriet Beecher Stowe. She wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Me and you, I don't know about you. Let me not say you. I grew up calling people Uncle Toms, who I now call the HN. You know what I mean?
Right.
On Django.
Yeah, we could be clear. I mean, this is where we get terms like Sambo from Harriet Beecher Stowe. We get the terms like Sambo. Right, we get the terms like House Nigga and Uncle Tom come from Harriet Beecher Stowe.
Right. But it's the opposite.
And it's misused. Right. It's misused.
And it's misused. Uncle Tom in Harriet Beecher Stowe was a code name for Samuel Edmondson. He worked on Capitol Hill. Every time they were planning on doing something cruddy to black people or indigenous people or whoever, the folk on Capitol Hill would run and tell that.
Mm-hmm.
just like they did in New Orleans, just like they were doing up in Connecticut and Massachusetts and the Native American. They went in because they were in the inside. They were the inside people, and they would go and tell the truth. So Sam Emerson went and told the churches, hey, they plan on selling all the girls for sexual bondage.
Oh.
And they plan on selling our biggest and brawniest black men to as maters and fighters. You know, you saw Django.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's what they were selling these black men to do. Go fight, you know, go mate.
Right.
Be entertained, you know, and they were selling these girls to be mated,
right.
so they could have because domestic slave trade was the only thing that was legal. They had outlawed, you know, bringing in slaves from the transatlantic slave trade
mm-hmm.
that ended. So they wanted to grow the domestic slave trade.
They wanted to find new reasons. Again, what comes to mind is a very Roman kind of model where essentially, understand this, right? Because it hasn't changed much, right? So if slavery did not end, right, with these areas that we see black people in, where, you know, going back to the, you know, I keep on talking about Monique, but it's whatever. But think about it like this. Think about it like this, right? Entertainment industry where black people don't make that much money. That's what you would have been doing as a slave if you weren't going to be, because it wasn't cost effective to make slavery. Like you weren't going to go and take a you know, $1,100 slave and go put him in a factory or have him moving steel. It wasn't cost effective. So yes, you were going to be a boxer. And, you know, you were going to be a basketball player, football player, things like that. You were going to be entertainment. You were going to be what they call a comfort girl or a prostitute. You see what I'm saying? And these are the areas where black people are still, they're like, oh, I don't want to pay you to do that. I don't want to pay you to entertain me.
Which is the biggest issue for me when I think about the Pearl is and why the Pearl needs to be built. It is, and this ain't even me. I didn't even want to do this. Let me be very clear to everybody, because I want to be completely honest. I had a comfortable existence. I was married. I had my babies. I knew doing this work, and I told my grandfather this, and we laughed about it. I knew doing this work would not allow me, because I believed I could work within the system to make change. Mm-hmm. I really did. When I met you, I had grown up a little bit by the time we met.
Yeah. I think that's when you just said, fuck that shit. You met me right at fuck it. I meet most people right at fuck it or right before the fuck it.
Yeah. hey. When the student is ready, the teacher will appear. You know? But life had really kicked me in the nuts, and it kicked me in the nuts because because I believe that when I went to college, it was after the crack epidemic, and I thought that the crack epidemic had happened in DC because people were just dumb, and I could go to college and figure it out and come back and provide my community with solutions. Then I get back and realize that DC was more segregated than North Carolina. I get back and realize Greensboro had started busing 20 years after 1969. They started busing to ensure that there was racial diversity throughout the entire state. They still do that. We don't do that in DC. We have all white schools. Then we have white schools that are middle class. Then we have some with sprinkles of black kids in them. We got the most segregated Deep South school system I've ever seen in this city.
That's a fact.
All right. So so when I started seeing that and doing the Pearl, it just changed me. My grandfather wanted me to do it because he wanted to make sure that the story was told by us, not necessarily me, but by us, people who didn't have an interest in selling out. All right. It ain't in me to sell out, clearly. All right. I've been confronted with the whole.
I've had the opportunity to sell out many times. This is why I say that David Smith should be the mayor of Washington, D.C.
Like, let's be clear. I could have had this boat built 20 years ago. I could have been took the millions I've been offered. But that means I wouldn't have been able to tell a story. It means my children wouldn't have any equity in the ownership economically from it. It means none of our children would be owned by some historic institution. And all the money from the story, just like we talked about through manumission, would be leaving our community. So the only way to do this the way my grandfather asked me to do it, which is why he started Marshall Heights Community Development Organization, I'm not too clear what they're doing with the mission and why he started it and the people. I'm not satisfied with that. He started City First Bank. I'm actually very pleased with City First Bank. They're putting their money into the community. You know, it's never perfect, but they're doing it. And these organizations, even Marshall Heights, they are still trying to fulfill these missions. So when he asked me to do this, I had no choice but to try my best to make sure that the story was told. So on my board right now, on my advisory board, I have great people who are partially pleased with me. I would probably be, you know, some of them probably pretty upset with me too.
Well, you wouldn't be a good leader if they weren't upset and partially pleased.
Right, you can't please everyone, right? But one of my favorite board members is Raleigh Marshall. You know, he's a direct descendant of Paul Jennings. His family was on the boat. He still has the house in Georgetown that his great, you know, Paul Jennings had. You know, he knows history inside and out, very passionate. I mean, some really great people that are connected to this story. If someone's going to tell the story that ain't a Washingtonian, it need to be his family or the Edmondson family. Or they need to make the revenue. So they need to be supported so they can tell the story authentically.
Right.
And that's the struggle that we've been under. I could have given this away. You know, I could have sold, but then the story would have been Hollywood, and you wouldn't have known about the white folk on the boat, the black folk on the boat. You wouldn't have known about the people the oppressors and the house niggers who were there was a taxi cab driver. Here's a cool story. The taxi cab driver who, you know, horse and buggy, who brought most of the people to the boat was a guy named Diggs. He had the only public transportation company in the city, owned by a black man, right? So when Dolly Madison woke up the next morning, she called the magistrate of D.C. They went and got the police and the magistrate went and got Diggs. They got Diggs because they knew that he knew, because he was the only one that could have provided them with this sort of transportation to the boat. Now, this is where the debate begins. And this is a very interesting story. Some people say he snitched. And the history supports that. They definitely got information from Diggs that the people got on the boat. The boat was long gone at this point.
Yeah, I don't know. They just got on some boat.
But we don't have any details about what happened after Diggs was captured. And we don't have any details of what happened to Diggs after he was captured.
Right.
I'm sure he didn't survive the...
they probably killed Diggs.
I'm sure they killed him, and I'm sure they did a whole bunch of unpleasant things to him before they did. So the question becomes, did he snitch? Or should he, you know? So, you know, you got all of these cultural issues that we deal with as black men in the black community, black women in the black community, between our own culture from this incident. You know, you had a black man that was involved that in theory snitched on the escape. Had he kept his mouth closed, me and you might not be having this conversation. So you got all of these things engraved in the story. It's an amazing story.
I'm sure you saw me just kind of zone out real quick. I just looked up Dolly Madison. Right? I just wanted to be more familiar. So I looked up Dolly Madison because in my mind, I was thinking about Ashley Madison.
I'm glad you looked it up.
because you know, I know that the Edmondson sisters were supposed to be used as comfort girls, and then I thought about that, like, what was Dolly Madison doing? It's just the same family. They running a prostitution ring as old as.
Now, Dolly actually treated her slaves really well, based on what the family's history says. What's interesting about, she owned the Jennings girls. Paul Jennings worked in the White House. For generations, that family was just the Butler. You know, the movie The Butler. That's the Paul Jennings family for over 100 years.
Okay.
So imagine you got some of the most educated folk working in the White House for president after president after president.
So Dolly Madison was renting her slaves to the White House, basically.
She bought them back to D.C. to rent them out or sell them because her oldest son had done some mischievous business dealings, and it costed them greatly. And one of the Jennings slaves was worth more than her entire estate. I think her debt, and keep in mind, at that period, if you own debt, wasn't nothing worse than that.
Right.
And so her debt, I think, was $400, and she was selling one Jennings girl for like $1,200. And so you think about, she owned hundreds of acres of land, and her debt was $300. So a Jennings slave was worth $1,200. So that tells you how much.
Right. Again, the market during slavery when you talk about the labor market, black people brought the
They made
most
the most.
money in. You know, if you think about it, they brought the most money in. You
Your
know,
business, most businesses during that period sold for $50. I mean, you talking about Fortune 500 companies selling for $200, $1,000 maybe.
I mean, on
And
the
you got
website, you said, what's his name? Sam Emerson was a blacksmith, and $100 was half of his earnings. So you're talking about
yeah,
selling these girls for $1,200, which wasn't even the highest they could sell a woman for. They could sell a woman for almost twice that much.
yeah. Most women, most educated, DC based, urban environment based women who could take care of a home, could build a home, was virtuous, a virtuous woman basically. So about 2,000, 3,000, because they would have 12, 13 children.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, women breeding was, good Lord. I mean, it was the most valuable thing you could do. And once a child was born into slavery under your bond, you own a slave for life because of the law.
Right.
So it was a profitable business.
Mm-hmm.
It's the
And
most profitable in the
right.
country.
And people don't really, I think that people don't really get that perspective, the money that was really involved in it, because that alone lets you know what it's, because a lot of folks had this opinion that like every white person owns a slave.
No.
And every white person couldn't have owned a slave. It was
Cost too much money.
too much money, right?
Much money.
Right. It was not like candy. We had this opinion that, oh yeah, it was like buying a puppy and they didn't treat you like you was human. You know what? Here's the thing, right? I would guarantee you that if you cost more than, it costs more to have a slave than it was to have a woman.
Yeah.
So think about it like that. You know what I'm saying? So it's
And they
like,
would take care of their slave first.
and they
I
take
mean,
care of their slave first. So
yeah.
they treated you like if they didn't treat you like you was a human, they treated you better than a human.
Yeah, but
You know,
John, the only thing I can say about that is I would rather be dead than
I,
be
I'm
a
not.
woman.
I don't listen. I'm not an advocate of trying to bring slavery back. It's
Oh,
not like that.
but
But what I'm saying is
I
to put
get
it
your point.
right,
But,
to put it in perspective, so that
I
people
mean,
understand. Because I feel like the atrocity that happened to quote unquote African Americans or blacks happened after the Civil War. I think the atrocity happened in what the political atmosphere leading up to the Spanish American War, where where the United States decided that our imperial goals are more important than dealing with people who betrayed the country, and then we allowed them to then steer the narrative so that they'd work with us to fight the Spanish. That's really what and then our atrocity came there, because after that point, then it was like, now you have to prove to me that you really want to be free. Go fight the Spanish American War. Oh, well, it's not going to work out. You still niggas. You can't own shit. You can't have shit. We don't want you to work. Prove to me you want a little bit more. Go fight World War One. Go fight, go fight this one. Go fight this war.
yeah.
And then finally, after World War II, it kind of gets tired. And you have like people like our grandfathers who came in at Korean World War II, and
Yeah.
they got into looking at the policy, and they got into like actually working in governments and developing these plans. And then you had a wave of brothers that went in for Vietnam, who then came back on drugs and resentful.
Yeah, and resentful and angry. And then you had massive assassinations of the people that were taking that wealth, taking that knowledge, taking that influence, and trying to do something with it.
That's right.
What's really interesting, and you got to understand that, and how everything that you just said is about a cycle. Every 30 years we're in a war. Every 20 years we're in a war. And if you look, who makes the money every time? I'm not going to answer that question.
Mm-hmm.
Who goes to war every time? I'm not even going to waste my time answering that question. And what you'll find is, I'm going to go back to the Spanish American War after the Civil War. What you talked about, you're right. To me, that's one of the greatest atrocities in U.S. history. And I'm going to add to that, a log to that fire. The Seminoles in Florida are not a Native American tribe. They are a people, a culture, of a confluence of all the tribes from D.C. all the way around the Mississippi down to Florida, everyone could escape to Florida. The Seminoles were known to be warriors, and if you could just make it there, you could be free. That was the only place in America you could be free. They were never defeated. They signed a treaty with General Custer, who was a savage, who went around killing women and children while the war was going on. You know, that was not considered good war. You didn't go to the village where the civilians were and kill civilians. You stayed on the war field, not General Custer. General Custer would wait for the war, and then he would send a special battalion to go kill the women and children of these men and find them because he wanted to demoralize them. That's the term that they use. That's the term that savages use, demoralization, meaning that they have no morals. But anyway, so finally, most of the Seminoles, most of the Native Americans that were in South Carolina, Mississippi, Virginia, Maryland, who were resisting, Accokeek, Maryland, along the rivers, Chesapeake, a lot of these Native Americans decided to leave. And what we know as the Trail of Tears is only one aspect of what really happened under General Custer. Most of the Seminoles went to Texas. So right after that treaty was signed, you had the Trail of Tears, and you had this mass exodus of all of these indigenous people moving from the East Coast to the Texas, California area to try based on this treaty. Then the moment that this treaty was signed, we go to war. Spanish-American War. And then we send the same black soldiers who were trained by these Seminoles to go destroy and get them out of Texas. So, of course, it wasn't largely us against us.
Right.
But from a historical context,
it just looks worse. Right. It looks a lot worse.
Yeah, because so who was intelligent enough? Because the only reason me and you can have this conversation is because we can look back on it and see what happened.
Right.
If I was living at that time, I could not have come to this conclusion. And the only way we can be safe about making sure these things don't happen in the future is to understand what happened in the past. Because when we look at, and I'm in D.C., and I try to get people to look at what's happening globally on look in your neighborhood. What's happening in our neighborhoods are happening globally. Who is making the money at the end of the day? Follow the money, and you'll find the truth about all our conversations. It ain't about education, because somebody making a lot of money off miseducating our children right now, right? It ain't about health. Yeah. It's about health. We spending billions on health, but people in my neighborhood still dying from high blood pressure and diabetes.
Well, I add it like this, right? I say this. It's not even that. I think it's about people want to make money for free. So, and they look at who is the most susceptible to get free money off of. So when you look at the school system, right? You look at miseducation, right? We had this situation where we have a bunch of people, right, who go to college every year into a system that doesn't support nor breed entrepreneurship. Which means that as you stop producing entrepreneurs, now it's like a butterfly effect for the next generations on how we're going to create jobs. So then how are we going to create jobs? Right, exactly. So then you have these teachers unions who have created this model where they can basically push the government to say we need some more money. So the governments are dumping money into the school system that's going into people's salaries, and it's not going into education. So then I think that if you had a system that went into education, then we wouldn't have this stale education system. But the reason why certain communities become easily susceptible for that is because if you're working class, you're fucking working. And you don't have and you ain't got time for PTA meetings and all of that other stuff. So I'm not going to do that here. I can do that in the communities where there's people who aren't watching. I can't do that where there's a mother in yoga pants who's going to be all over me if they come home and they say, well, where's the homework? What's going on with this? That's right. I'm in a situation where my daughter is smarter than where they give her credit to be, because when they do reading tests and she reads through this part, she reads through that part, and the teacher says, okay, you've done enough. they don't get to the point where she can't read it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So then there's that aspect that we don't think about, is that when you add human nature to it all, you know what I mean? When you add the fact that, look at what happens. Like you've been running a nonprofit, which is essentially the same as running your own business. When you have this thing.
We have for-profit companies too. You can find them on our website.
Okay. But I mean, you got, so as an entrepreneur, right, and you go into your community, it may not be the same for you because you come from a background of entrepreneurs, but essentially when you're an entrepreneur, people look at you like you have 8 legs.
Yeah, true.
And what I find is, for me, like, people come to me and they say, oh, let me see if I can figure out how to do that, because this nigga, he doesn't seem special. So, like I must be able to do that too. I'm not going to pay him for that. And you have that reality. So, so we kind of become susceptible for this quote unquote policy. Because again, when you look at what was happening and, further west, and you see these communities that are, thriving in business, despite the quote unquote racism, it has to do with the fact that they say, I'm going to do whatever I'm doing. And if my community supports what I'm doing, then other people will support what I'm doing too. And if other people support what I'm doing, then I'm in a position where I can support the community. And it doesn't work outside that model. And what we do,
it does.
And I think that I know this is your interview, but anyway, this is my last comment, right? But as black people, I think what we do, or whatever, is we have the expectation that you're going to do something for the community before you get in a position when you can do something for the community.
And I would be an example of that. I mean, over the last 7 years, I ran a political campaign. I was the president of the Deanwood Deanwood Citizens Association. I did it because my daughter got shot in a home robbery. And
I didn't know that.
You didn't know Maya got shot?
No, I didn't know that. Nah, man.
Yeah. And it costed me almost everything. I'm battling now just to pay my bills and keep my house, because they were moving all the poor people from the city east of the river. And the person that shot my daughter had just moved from Northwest, him and his boys, they all out here getting high. I'm hot. Telling me I'm hot. This is after I was hot. Dude, I'm sorry. I don't really want to talk about that.
Right.
I'm going to get upset.
Yeah.
My point is, I took on an active role in my community. I had no choice. I couldn't sit on the sideline and let them move all these poor people next to me. Keep in mind, I'm poor.
Right.
So it's not about being poor. It's about the fact that who's going to give us jobs?
Right.
How we going?
Like, what are you going to do? What's the plan that happens after you just move all these people over here?
The plan was they're going to let us carnage each other. And that's what was happening. My house got robbed 8 times. I mean, we had like 19 robberies by the same group of guys. And we told the police who those groups, we knew everything. No action. Our politicians that look like us did nothing. Okay. So it's one of these, it goes back to the example that you said. This is the way it works. When you are an entrepreneur or you have small businesses in your community, that insulates you economically. If someone falls on hard times, those small businesses can give them a job. Those small businesses can afford to buy them groceries. Those small business owners can make donations and buy cupcakes for the PTA. But when your community has an economic chasm, it becomes virtually impossible. Like you said, you don't have that yoga mom who work out at 11 a.m. and then go visit the school and participate in the PTA. You don't have that my father who used to come home after work and then go coach and teach Bible study. We don't have that at the numbers that we used to have. And our families are not the same. The structures are different. And without the economics, with these single parent households, and I'm a single dad with 5 kids. They live with me. I know it's an amazing thing. And I am grateful. But when I'm working, who is going to be the most spending time with my children is more important than money. But if I don't have money, we're gonna be homeless.
Like, what are we gonna do? Like, it's catch-22.
It's a catch-22. So I had to sacrifice money and risk being homeless to make sure that this Pearl Project happened and make sure my community was safe. Because even if we have this house and we have money, if we are slaves and my children are in danger walking from the subway to the house, what difference do it make if I got a house if my daughter's gonna get shot or my son get killed on the way home?
Right.
So it's hard for me to articulate. We are not in the position as a culture in this country, regardless of your race, to take a sideline seat to gentrification. It's a matter of time before these racist and social classist economic policies are visited upon everyone's family, because eventually it won't be them against us. It'll be them against them. And it's just a matter of time. And we have got to figure out a way to unite. In my opinion, the Pearl is the perfect story about how people came together then and how we need to come together now.
That's right.
It transcends race. It transcends class. It transcends an imaginary dividing line between Maryland, Virginia, and D.C. It's about us people. You know, we live in this area, and we need to do everything we can to ensure that every human being has a quality of life that is comparable to my own. If you faking like you're a Christian or Muslim or a Jew, and you don't treat other people the way you want to be treated, you are not living the credos of your faith.
That's right.
So that's all I'm saying in this conversation. That's what we need to be working on. That's what the Pearl and the story of the Pearl is about. It's about creating educational systems where we can self-educate. We got a living museum on that river so our kids from generation can go down there and find the truth about our history on their own. All right, without the fear of someone lying to them about who they are. And the second thing is to create economic opportunity around that boat. You know, where are my small businesses? So we've created a few small businesses, TPC Transportation. We have a Safi Lewis. She just graduated from Delaware State. She's a little small entrepreneur. She does graphic design. Ja, you the man. You know, people should be working with you. You know, we got a bunch of small business owners that are connected. Matter of fact, I got some jewelry from Ja. I need to be rocking that thing right now. So now folks know. That's what I get my from Ja. You know, because that man, he's the man. Custom jewelry, I get energy and everything, you know. So that's the goal. That's what my grandfather wanted me to accomplish with the boat. Not just build the boat, not just talk about Black history, but create opportunity that lasts more than one generation.
Right.
And it's not easy, but I know I know we'll get it done, and hopefully we'll be getting it done this year.
All right. Well, beautiful interview, brother. Man, it was great talking to you. Again, just for the listening audience, could we run down the social media and the websites and everything for everybody listening?
Absolutely. So you can find out more information about more about the Escape on the Pearl. You can learn information. You can volunteer to help build the Pearl. We're actually starting to build it. We build a few cross sections of it now. That's on display at the Matthew Henson Center. You can go on our website at www.pearlcoalition.org. You can follow us on Twitter and Facebook, also Pearl Coalition. So if you just hashtag, if you want to find out what we've been doing with the money you've donated, or you want to find out who has been donating to us, you can just put in hashtag Build the Pearl. I would like to send a couple shout outs to Jack Evans on the city council. He was the first council member, him and Marion Burry were the first two council members to actually do something and help me with the Pearl by finding ways to help me get some locations, some money, etc. I'd like to give a shout out to Joseph Horning and the Horning Foundation, Lynn, his wife. They're great supporters. Douglas Jamal committed to supporting the Pearl. Doug, I need that check, Doug.
Let's get the check, Doug.
Doug, I need that check. Stan, Valdry, I need my check. William C. Smith, great supporter. When I need him for the art, I can get it. But Will, I need some money, Will. City First Bank, they were the first corporate sponsor that we had. That website you see is actually, I did it myself. So don't be joning. It does need some editing. If you got a graphic design firm, we're looking for some help. I want to redo that website. City First Bank was responsible for that. Thank you, City First Bank. Donna Cooper at Pepco. I would marry Donna, but she won't have me. But I want to thank her and Pepco for their ongoing support. Got some great people down there. That's a whole nother conversation about energy. And there's a lot of other people I want to thank. I want to thank the Jennings family. I want to thank Asbury Methodist Church. So for your listeners, you need to check out Asbury Methodist Church. When the Pearl Escape was happening, most of the people hid in that church. And then Frederick Douglass helped them get there, right? And that's amazing history that no one knows. That church is still there on, I want to say 11th and K.
11th and K. That's on this side. That's the northeast.
Northwest.
Okay. Up like, okay.
It was that church in the White House. I mean, like you could see the White House from the church at one point. Right. That's how powerful African American churches and people were in this city. I mean, we built this city. It's not a game. It's really not a game. So, but I want to thank everybody. There's so many people I could thank right now, John. Thank you, man. I mean, when I started working with you, I mean, that year that we worked together, those young people graduated. They went on and got jobs. They went to college. And it's because men like you, man, and your family. Because I ain't even had to interview you. I met you. I knew. You got good spirit, man. Keep doing the work you're doing, bro.
Well, thank you, David, man. It was great talking to you, man. Thank you very much for coming on, man. And we'll probably talk later. We'll probably talk like soon or tomorrow or something like that. But
right. Plus, I got a piece. I want to order a piece. I need a new.
Oh yeah, we gotta do that. Oh yeah. But you come at the right time, man. I've had like a revelation with the energy creation and all that. So we'll definitely talk. So I'll give you a call or you call me or whatever. But this was David Smith. Thanks a lot for coming on, brother. Have a good night. All right. Peace. Okay, everybody, that was David Smith of the Pearl Coalition. I'm not gonna stay on. I'm not gonna hold you. You've been here for 2 hours. I appreciate you. I think Dave. I think I saw Divine. I think I seen Everlasting pop on. I think I seen a couple of my Facebook friends. I think I seen my mom or whoever else is listening. Thanks for staying on with us. We'll be doing a rebroadcast on YouTube and also tentatively on CPSP Radio, I believe. Thank you to them on Stand Up Radio. They're going to be rebroadcasting as well. So thanks a lot, everybody. Have a good day, a good night, whatever. How do I finish?